Welcome back to The Faith-Driven Entrepreneur. Stewardship of a paycheck can feel much different than something that you've created. After all, you had the vision, right? You took the risk. But everything we've been given is a gift to be stewarded. And as we lean into that reality, we're going to be free to create and do great business and to lead our people and also know God more fully. We're going to talk about that more here. We're working with God's goods. We're the cooks in His kitchen. That's the honest, humbling truth. Even and perhaps especially, if you started your own business, you're creating out of the ingredients God created first. We see this in the Garden of Eden, right? Adam didn't create the garden. He cultivated it. Instead of owning it, he stewarded it. And that's what entrepreneurs can do with our businesses as well. But if we're being honest, there's a part of us that wants to push back. It's my business after all. I came up with the idea. I did the hard work. I raised all the funding. I hired all the people. What does God have to do with what I've created? Truthfully, there's a great healthy tension here. If your company is growing year after year thanks to your ability to bootstrap and your consistent hard work and effort, it's hard to surrender ownership of that to anyone. It's never easy to look at our companies, businesses, and ideas and say that they're not ours, that they're God's. But if God is who He says He is, then everything already belongs to Him anyway. So will we struggle to possess and hoard that which we've been given to protect and cultivate? Or will we fight the daily battle to submit ourselves to the role of steward and surrender our businesses to the God who already owns it all? Let's start exploring this topic by watching this powerful story, talking about stewardship and ownership, about how God worked in this life.
I'm Debbie Oakes, and I grew up here in Wichita.
Pete Oakes, grew up in Hoisington, Kansas, a small farming community a couple hours from Wichita. We have been married 35 years.
I'm an entrepreneur by birth, probably, and I grew up in a farming family, so we were used to doing lots of things for ourselves, and I think that probably carried through into the life that I now live. Started out in the commercial banking business and spent 8 years doing that. Then I left that and started an investment banking company, which we really acted as the middleman in deal situations. After 8 or 10 years in the investment banking business, we began to buy a deal or two. And so over the last 20 or 30 years, we've purchased a company here, there. Our approach is to grow it, treat our employees fairly, serve them well, run the business with excellence, and be a good steward of the resources God's given us.
Okay, let's go. Hold on here. Come on.
After a number of years, probably 10 years, owning our own business, we had become more financially successful than I ever thought I would. I began to realize that while I had that financial success, I still wasn't satisfied. Deb and I both grew up in homes that were very generous, so we understood generosity from a very early age. When we became married, we wanted to carry that on. That was probably in our DNA, generosity. But I think for the first few years of our lives, we were really, I would say I was a 90-10 guy. I wanted to make a lot of money so that my 10% to God was a big number. Well, you can imagine what I had planned for the 90%. And thanks to a couple of older mentors that came alongside of me and really guided me along, they opened my eyes up to this whole concept of stewardship. It really means we're just the managers. We don't really own anything. So when you understand that, it puts a whole new spin and a whole new context on how you live life.
I think we began to learn these concepts and came home and applied them to our lives. We experienced the joy of giving.
So this journey for us has probably been a 15, we're into it 15 or 20 years. And a number of years ago, of course, that glaring question always comes up, how much is enough? If I'm really the steward, how much is enough? It was interesting because we were fortunate enough to meet some other entrepreneurs who were struggling with the same issues. We've just agreed that we understand the accountability piece is very important. And we all understand that money is probably could be our biggest downfall. There are actually guys in the group that will allow others of us to set their salary. And maybe that's too strong a word, but that we give them strong guidance on what we think is an appropriate lifestyle. And many of them could live way beyond those numbers, but we've just chosen to live at that range. Several years ago, we were in an acquisition mode, and we came on an opportunity to build industrial seating. It had some of the same technology we were using in our other business, so we thought it would be a good fit. And it's a fairly straightforward process and somewhat labor-intensive. This analogy that you should have a generous life, and life is an acrostic, L-I-F-E. It stands for you should be generous with your labor, you should be generous with your influence, you should be generous with your financial resources, and you should be generous with your expertise. When we understood that, I began to look at our businesses and say, these are resources that God has given us, and how can we use them not only to create treasure, but to create social capital and spiritual capital. God really convicted me that generosity is much more than just writing a check.
This was a new thing for us. We had never had a business in a prison before. The first time I went to the prison and heard those gates slam behind me, your heart skips a beat. You're like, this is for real.
It's an unusual bunch of guys or inmates that we have working for us at the prison. They've committed the worst crimes known to society.
I ended up being an accomplice to taking someone's life.
I took someone's life who didn't deserve to be taken.
I have a life sentence.
The jury convicted me of second-degree murder intentional, so I got 13 years, and I've done 6 of it so far.
It came to us that we needed a big vision for these guys to grab onto. The vision we cast for them was this: we want to have the best prison in the United States of America. They looked at me like I was some kind of a man from outer space.
We thought he was crazy. Like, this guy, he's, at first, that's what we thought,
Every couple of weeks we have what we call a life lesson. It may be how to be a good father. It may be lessons on finance. It's lessons on relationships. In one of our life lessons, we presented this whole concept of generosity and challenged them that we would match dollar for dollar any dollar that they gave to one of a number of charities, and we gave them a list. It was amazing the amount of monies that these prisoners gave to charity, and what was probably even more fun is most of the charities that they gave to were charities that existed to help the victims of the crime that they committed.
Not too long ago, he was in our living area. I've never seen a volunteer do anything like that. He's come to church with us. He's come to banquets that we've had. He's very involved, and you can tell that he's invested.
Seeing the motivation they have to help you out, it makes you want to help other people out.
So he's proving to me and to the rest of us that, man, if you set your heart to something, if you really fight for it, and if you're focused on it, it can happen.
Pete, I believe that he has a desire to see us succeed.
And the most important thing I've learned through this journey of generosity is the component of faith.
It's all out of gratitude, and it all began with what Christ did for us.
Last session, we started in the garden, so let's stay there for a moment because there's something that we got to recognize before we move on. Adam didn't create the garden, remember? He cultivated it. That means instead of owning the garden, he stewarded it. You say, well, what's the difference in those? Well, an owner says, it belongs to me. An owner says, I earned this, I bought it, it was my resources that got it, it was my strength, so I can do what I want with it. A steward, by contrast, says, well, no, it belongs to God. I mean, sure, I'm working at it and I get to enjoy some of the fruits of my labor, but my gifts and my talents and my time and my resources, they're given to me by God for a purpose that He has, so I want to know what God wants me to do with those things. You know, there's lots of dimensions of spiritual maturity that occur gradually. But this change, the change between being an owner and being a steward, is something that happens all at once. You suddenly realize that you're not an owner of anything that you have. Your time, your talent, your treasures, all of that ultimately is given to you by God. When you make this shift, you're going to stop asking questions like, well, how much of this do I have to give to God to stay on His good side? And you're going to start asking questions like, well, why did God give me any of this? Why did He give me this enterprise? Why did He give me this skill? Why did He give me this idea? It's all His. What does He want with it? He owns 100% of it, not just a fraction of it. Many Christians think like owners. They think that their religious obligation is to pay God basically his tax off of their lives and their earnings. So that looks like, well, let's give God 10% of my money and 90% of it belongs to me. That's thinking in terms of an owner who has to pay a tax. Or maybe you're thinking, I got to go to church once a week and I got to be engaged in religion in that way. That's a tax on your time. You see, a steward thinks differently. A steward says, all of it, 100% of it is yours. The breath of my body is yours. The talents are yours. How do you want me to use these talents for you? So you got to ask yourself, if you're going to think like a steward, why did God bless me as He did? Why? What is the reason that I can discern He gave me this talents? I'd say many of us understand this, but we try to resist it. In fact, it reminds me of the preacher who was speaking to a farmer in his community, a farmer who had just produced this beautiful field of crops, and the preacher says to the farmer, hey, God gave you this beautiful field and you should give Him the glory for it. To which the farmer replies, well, you should have seen this place when it only belonged to God. As in, I did all this and all these crops I get the credit for. We might not be that brazen in response to God, but we do think it's my business. I came up with the idea. I did the hard work. I raised all the funding. I hired all the people. So what does God have to do with what I have created? And yeah, if your company has grown year after year thanks to a lot of hard work and late nights by you and some effort and some ingenuity, yeah, it's hard to surrender ownership of that to anybody. It's never easy to look at our company or our business or an idea and say that it's not mine really, that it's God's. But here's the thing. If God really is who He says He is, then everything already belongs to Him anyway. The skills, the health, the opportunity, it's all from God. In Deuteronomy 10, Moses said to the children of Israel, to the Lord your God belongs the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth and everything in it. Paul would agree in the book of Colossians. He would say that all things, including the breath in our bodies and the talents in our brains, they're all from Jesus. They're given for His purposes. And ultimately, it's His strength that sustains them all, even as we use them, and they exist for His purposes. And see, if God owns it all, that means that we are stewards. And the most important question we have to ask is what He wants from the things that He has given us. He tells us in 2 Corinthians that when He gives us financial success, for example, that part of the reason that He does that is to increase our potential for impact in His kingdom. In 2 Corinthians 9, Paul says to the Corinthian believers, God will enrich you in every way to increase your seed for sowing. Why does God increase us and give us success? It is to increase our seed for sowing. Hey, what that means is that God has a lot more to give, but who's He going to give it to? Right? Is He going to give it to the farmer who hoards it, or is He going to give it to the farmer who increases the amount of his sowing? God wants to multiply and bless His people. You will find that from cover to cover in the Bible. But He does so under the assumption that His people will use the increase that He gives them to sow more into His kingdom, not just build more of their own kingdoms. God multiplies our resources to increase our standard of giving, not just our standard of living. When you understand this, you will see, in fact, That when you don't use your time and your treasure and your talents for God's purposes, you're actually stealing. You're embezzling God's resources and his money and his opportunity. Think about how upset you would be if you made a huge donation to feed the children, for example, and then found out that 90% of your donation went to the CEO so that he could upgrade his house or buy some new cars, and the money that you gave didn't go to feeding the children. You would rightly be outraged because that guy was stealing what wasn't meant for him, but was actually given for a different purpose. In the same way, when we don't use our talents and our opportunities and our resources for the purposes God gave them to us for, then we're stealing from God. Listen, our enterprises, your enterprise, may not all be nonprofits. In fact, we need a lot more for-profit businesses. But all of us should have that posture that what we have built is really what God has built through us. It's from God, and 100% of it ultimately needs to be for God. God has made a donation to our business, and he expects us to steward it the way that he intends. He wants you to use his donations for his purposes. If you sit on them or you use them for your own luxuries, it's like in his mind you're embezzling money, you're stealing from him. We are stewards of God's resources. We are not owners of our own. I want to end this session by talking about one other scriptural principle that impacts this idea, and that is a principle of abundance. You see, God did not create a world of scarcity. He created a world of potential abundance. This is a bedrock principle of entrepreneurship. There's not a limited amount of resources out there to fight over. There's new money, there's increased wealth, there's new ideas to come up with and new money to be made. You see, there are two ways to look at the world. If we live in a world of scarcity, then we think we have to hang on to and hoard what we have. The other way of looking at the world is to live in a world of abundance, where through the blessing of God, there is literally more than enough for everybody. The whole Bible screams abundance. Just think for a moment about the Garden of Eden. If you think about the dimensions of the Garden of Eden, if you just go through Genesis and track out, how big it tells you it was more like Yellowstone National Park for two people. I mean, that is abundance. That is so much that is there for them. When Israel wandered in the wilderness, every morning God covered the ground with so much manna, like little rich crackers dropped down from heaven, so much that everybody had as much as they wanted. He said literally to them, eat all you want and don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll just cover the ground again with more. That's abundance. God created the world with abundance. He intends us to think in abundant ways when we engage in business and ideas. Sinful man, in his fear, always thinks in terms of scarcity. There's not going to be enough, so I better hoard. So in the story of the manna, for example, Israel tried in fear to stockpile the manna. Well, God gave us all this abundance today, but there's no telling what's going to happen tomorrow. I better hoard and hang on to everything. And when they did that, the manna went bad. From start to finish in the Bible, God instructs his people to look at the world through the lens of abundance. He created a world with the potential for plenty to go around, and there's always more to create. When we look at our possessions and our talents that way, holding them with an open and a generous hand, the world flourishes. Economists will tell you that the scarcity mentality in a country leads to poverty. But when we realize that we serve a God of abundance and we open up our hands, well, that gives God a chance to multiply and produce a society of abundance where there's more than enough for everyone. So sow what you have, your talents, your resources in faith. Invest widely. Take strategic risks for the kingdom of God and give a lot away and watch God multiply it. In the New Testament, Jesus consistently praises the stewards who give it away, who invest it widely, creating more value for everybody. And the end result is that there's much more for everyone. So let me end this session with a question to you. How do you see your business, your talents, and your dreams? Do you see these things as being owned by you or being owned by God, of which you were just the steward? And if so, have you asked God why he gave you this success, why he gave you that idea, and have you begun to serve his purposes in it?
I hope you find it refreshing to understand that financial success provides us opportunities to do things for God, but yet also realize that a God who used 5 loaves and 2 fish actually doesn't need our money or our influence, lest we boast. He wants our heart, and too often money has a hold on our hearts. So giving it or feeling an undue anxiety that he needs us in our success can lead to a lot of disappointment. We look forward to joining you next time. In the meantime, please do check out Faith Driven Entrepreneur, where we've got a daily blog and a weekly podcast and a monthly newsletter. And we'd love to interact with you. We'd love to hear more about what you're struggling with on your entrepreneurial journey. How can we equip and empower and encourage you as you get out there and create and wrestle with things like money? We look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for joining us.